I never intended to uncover a decades-old mystery. Truth be told, I never intended to become a monk either. Life takes unexpected turns. Mine led me from a successful accounting career in Boston to the quiet halls of St. Benedict's Monastery at age 42. My brothers here call me a late vocation. Their gentle teasing a reminder that most find their calling much earlier. But perhaps it was precisely my late arrival that allowed me to see what others had missed. When Father Gregory handed me that rusted iron key on that rain-soaked April morning, I couldn't have known it would unlock more than just the abandoned chapel on the edge of our grounds. 4 nuns disappeared from there during a terrible storm, he told me, his weathered face solemn. They were never found. Those words should have been a warning. Instead, they became an invitation. My name is Brother Thomas, and what I discovered in that forgotten chapel changed everything. A hidden journal, secret financial records, a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of church and state. And at the center of it all, 4 women of faith who vanished without a trace 18 years ago, silenced because they dared to speak truth to power. I'm about to share their story and mine. A story of corruption, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice that would lead me from the sacred silence of monastery life into a world of danger I never imagined. Before I continue this journey, I need your help to ensure this story reaches everyone who should hear it. If you believe in the power of truth, please subscribe to this channel now, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Each subscription brings us one step closer to justice for those 4 brave women who disappeared on that stormy night so long ago. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, to a small stone chapel where rainwater dripped from my coat onto a dusty floor, and where the first pages of a hidden journal would forever change the course of my life. The first time I saw St. Catherine's Chapel, it was through sheets of rain that seemed determined to wash away the very memory of the place. I had been at St. Benedict's Monastery in rural Massachusetts for just 3 months, having taken my vows after years of searching for purpose. My name is Brother Thomas, and at 42, I was what the other monks jokingly called a late vocation. That April morning in 2025, Father Gregory had asked me to retrieve some old records from St. Catherine's, a small stone chapel that sat abandoned on the edge of our property. The rain had been relentless for days, turning the monastery grounds into a muddy labyrinth. As I made my way across the sodden lawn, my boots sinking into the earth with each step, I couldn't help but feel a strange reluctance growing within me. It's been locked up since the incident, Father Gregory had said, his weathered face solemn as he handed me a heavy iron key. 4 sisters disappeared from there during a terrible storm in 2007. They were never found. The key felt cold in my palm, its weight seemingly disproportionate to its size. What happened to them? I had asked, watching raindrops collect on Father Gregory's silver hair. Father Gregory's eyes had drifted toward the window, where lightning occasionally illuminated the distant chapel. No one knows for certain. The police investigated for months. Their car was still in the parking lot. No signs of struggle. It was as if they simply walked out into the storm and vanished. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. And you want me to go there now? In this weather? The diocesan archives need these financial records, he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him our monastery's leader for over 20 years. They should be in the filing cabinet in the vestry. The chapel has been neglected for too long, Thomas. Perhaps it's time someone took care of it again. There was something in his tone I couldn't quite identify. Expectation, perhaps, or resignation. Either way, I found myself nodding and pocketing the key before my mind had fully processed what I was agreeing to do. So I made my way across the grounds, rain soaking through my coat despite my umbrella. The wind picked up as I approached the chapel, sending sheets of water sideways and rendering my umbrella nearly useless. By the time I reached the chapel door, my habit was soaked through, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. St. Catherine's stood silhouetted against the gray sky, its Gothic architecture somehow both beautiful and foreboding. The limestone walls had darkened with moisture, giving the building an almost bruised appearance. Gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their grotesque features worn smooth by decades of weather, water streaming from their mouths like endless tears. The path leading to the entrance was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks in the once carefully laid stones. A statue of St. Catherine herself stood beside the door, her expression serene, despite the moss creeping up her robes and the bird's nest tucked into the crook of her arm. The key turned with difficulty in the rusted lock. I had to lean my shoulder against the heavy wooden door, pushing until it finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo my own reluctance. The sound reverberated through the empty chapel, disturbing years of silence. The musty scent of abandonment greeted me as I stepped inside, closing my umbrella and shaking off what rain I could. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like tattered lace. The pews sat empty, waiting for worshippers who would never return. Weak light filtered through stained glass windows, depicting the life of St. Catherine of Siena, casting colored shadows across the stone floor, blues and reds and ambers dancing as the storm clouds shifted outside. I stood for a moment in the nave, water dripping from my clothes onto the floor, creating small puddles that reflected the stained glass above. The silence was absolute, save for the muffled sounds of rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Despite the disuse, there was still a sense of sacred space here, something that transcended the building's abandonment. Moving slowly down the center aisle, I traced my fingers along the tops of the pews, leaving trails in the thick dust. At the altar, candle stubs remained in their holders, wax frozen mid-drip where the flames had been extinguished for the final time. A faded missal lay open, its pages yellowed and curled with humidity. To the right of the altar, a small door led into the vestry. It stuck slightly, and I had to push harder than expected to open it. Inside was a small room with vestment closets along one wall and a desk beneath a narrow window. The promised filing cabinet stood in the corner, a hulking metal presence covered in a film of dust so thick I could write my name in it. Lightning flashed, illuminating the vestry in stark white light for an instant. Thunder followed almost immediately, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. I jumped despite myself, my heart racing irrationally. This was just an old building, empty of everything except memories and forgotten papers. In the filing cabinet, I found the financial records I'd been sent to retrieve. Folders of donation records, expense reports, and diocesan correspondence, all neatly labeled and organized. As I pulled open the drawer, something caught my eye, a small notebook wedged in the back. It wasn't part of the financial records I'd been sent to retrieve, but curiosity got the better of me. The notebook was bound in faded blue leather, its edges worn smooth from handling. I opened it to find neat, careful handwriting filling the pages, the kind of penmanship that comes from years of practice, each letter precisely formed. It was dated April 12, 2007, just 2 days before the sisters disappeared. I sat down at the dusty desk, laying the notebook before me. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows like desperate fingers trying to get in. The building creaked and settled around me. Sounds that would be unremarkable in daylight, but seemed somehow ominous in this abandoned place with its history of vanished women. As I began to read the first entry, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, not from fear of the supernatural. My faith had no room for such things, but from the growing certainty that I was holding something dangerous in my hands, something that people had killed to keep hidden. "Something isn't right here," Sister Maria had written. Her pen had pressed firmly into the paper, the words an accusation reaching out across 18 years of silence. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, I could almost see them, 4 women in traditional habits, moving through this very room, unaware that their days were numbered because they had stumbled upon something they were never meant to find. I glanced at my watch. I had told Father Gregory I would return before evening prayers, but as the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, and Sister Maria's words pulled me deeper into a mystery long buried, I knew I would not be leaving St. Catherine's Chapel anytime soon. Some truths once glimpsed cannot be unseen. Some paths once started upon must be followed to their end, no matter how dark. As another roll of thunder shook the ancient stones around me, I turned the page and continued reading, stepping irrevocably into the shadows of a story that had waited 18 years for someone to tell it. The journal belonged to Sister Maria Contreras, one of the 4 nuns who had vanished. I stood there in the dusty vestry, rainwater dripping from my coat onto the stone floor, and began to read. The pages felt delicate beneath my fingers, as if they might crumble under the weight of their own secrets. "Something isn't right here," she had written in that first entry, dated April 12, 2007. The penmanship was meticulous. Small, precise letters formed with the careful discipline of someone educated in Catholic schools before the digital age. Sister Agnes believes it's nothing more than old pipes and drafty windows, but I know better. The documents we found while cleaning out the basement storage, they shouldn't be here. They belong to the diocese archives in Boston. Why would they be hidden away here, of all places? Sister Catherine agrees with me that we should report this to Bishop Flanagan, but Sister Agnes insists we need to understand what we're dealing with first. I ran my finger along the edge of the page, feeling the slight indentations where her pen had pressed. Through the vestry window, lightning illuminated the graveyard behind the chapel, tombstones briefly standing in stark relief against the darkness before plunging back into shadow. The thunder that followed seemed to underscore the gravity of what I was reading. I flipped through more pages, my heart racing. The entries detailed growing tension among the 4 nuns: Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine. They had apparently discovered financial documents showing large sums of money moving through accounts that shouldn't have existed. Sister Maria's writing became more urgent with each entry, her normally impeccable handwriting occasionally slanting with emotion. "Sister Agnes finally examined the ledgers today," read an entry from April 13th. Even she cannot deny the discrepancies now. The amounts simply don't match what's being reported to the diocese. Where is the money going? And more importantly, where is it coming from? Some of these benefactors I've never heard of, yet they're supposedly donating tens of thousands of dollars each month. The journal included detailed notes on specific transactions that had raised her suspicions. Donations from shell companies with cryptic names, funds that appeared and disappeared within days, transfers to offshore accounts with no clear purpose. Sister Maria had meticulously documented everything, even drawing diagrams to map the flow of money. Sister Josephine accessed more records today, read another entry from later the same day. The amounts are staggering, millions of dollars, all passing through our small chapel's accounts before disappearing offshore. This has been happening for years, right under everyone's noses. We've decided to confront Father Donovan tomorrow. If he can't explain this satisfactorily, we're taking everything to the bishop and the authorities. Father Donovan. I recognize that name. He had been the chaplain assigned to St. Catherine's back then, but had transferred to a parish in Florida shortly after the nun's disappearance. According to monastery gossip, which flowed as freely among monks as among any group of people living in close quarters, he had died of a heart attack in 2015. Convenient, perhaps, that he was beyond questioning. I paused my reading to look around the vestry. The room felt different now, charged with the weight of what had happened here. I could almost see Sister Maria sitting at this very desk, pen in hand, documenting what she had found, unaware that her discoveries would lead to tragedy. The rain continued its relentless percussion on the roof as I returned to the journal. The next few entries detailed the sisters' growing anxiety as they prepared to confront Father Donovan. They had organized their evidence, made copies of key documents, even rehearsed what they would say. Sister Maria wrote of her sleepless nights, of prayers for guidance and strength. Sister Catherine is the most nervous, she had written. She's always been the gentlest among us, more comfortable with her books and gardens than confrontation. But she's also the most determined once her mind is set. The church must be clean, she keeps saying. We cannot allow this corruption under our roof. She's right, of course. There were personal touches throughout the journal as well. Sister Maria wrote of Sister Agnes's arthritis flaring up in the damp spring weather, of Sister Josephine's concern for her elderly mother in Detroit, of small moments of joy and camaraderie that punctuated their growing anxiety, shared meals, evening prayers, Sister Catherine's delight when her orchids bloomed. These women were not abstract figures from a police report. They were real, complex individuals with hopes and fears and daily routines. The pages seemed to grow heavier in my hands as I approached what I knew must be the final entry. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, rain lashing against the windows with renewed vigor, as if trying to warn me away from what I was about to read. The final entry was dated April 14th, 2007, written in a hurried scrawl that barely resembled Sister Maria's usual careful script. Thunder woke me at 2 a.m. Sister Josephine says someone's here. A car just pulled up. Father Donovan isn't alone. That was it. The last written words of Sister Maria Contreras before she and her 3 companions vanished into the stormy night 18 years ago. The rest of the pages remained blank, a testimony to abruptly ended lives, to stories cut short. I sat back in the chair, which creaked ominously beneath me. My mind was racing, connecting dots that had remained separate for nearly 2 decades. This wasn't just a journal, it was evidence. These women hadn't simply vanished, they had been silenced. The implications were staggering. If what Sister Maria had documented was true, then St. Catherine's Chapel had been used for money laundering operations involving millions of dollars. Father Donovan had been complicit, perhaps even a key player. And when 4 dedicated nuns had stumbled upon the truth, they had paid with their lives. How far did this conspiracy reach? Who else might have been involved? And why had the investigation been abandoned so quickly, with the disappearance labeled a mystery rather than pursued as the probable crime it was? I carefully closed the journal, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. What should I do with this information? The proper course would be to take it directly to Father Gregory, to let the church authorities handle it. But something held me back, a nagging doubt about how widely this corruption might have spread. After all, if Father Donovan had been involved, who else within the church hierarchy might have known or participated? Lightning flashed again, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that made the windows rattle in their frames. It felt like a sign, though of what, I couldn't say. I carefully placed the journal in the inner pocket of my coat, where it would be protected from the rain. I gathered the financial records I'd been sent to retrieve, tucking them into my leather document case. With one last look around the vestry, I turned off the small battery-operated lantern I'd brought and prepared to leave. As I stepped back into the main chapel, another flash of lightning illuminated the stained glass windows from outside, bringing the image of Saint Catherine momentarily to vivid life. The saint's face seemed to watch me, her expression both sorrowful and resolute. I found myself pausing before the altar, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. Kneeling on the worn stone floor, I offered a prayer for Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine, for justice too long delayed, for wisdom to know the right path forward. Then I rose, locked the chapel behind me, and made my way back through the unrelenting rain to the monastery. The journal, pressed against my chest, felt heavier with each step, as if the truth it contained had physical weight. I didn't tell Father Gregory about the journal when I delivered the requested financial records. Something told me to keep it to myself until I understood more. He seemed preoccupied anyway, barely looking up from his desk as I placed the folder before him. "The chapel needs work," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "The roof appears to be leaking in several places." "We'll see about repairs once this weather clears," he replied, still not looking at me. "Thank you, Brother Thomas." I hesitated, wondering if I should say more, if I should confide in him about what I had found. But the moment passed, and I found myself leaving his office, the secret still mine alone. That night, lying in my sparse cell with its narrow bed and single wooden chair, I read through Sister Maria's journal again, from beginning to end. The wind howled outside my window, branches scraping against the glass like skeletal fingers. The monastery creaked and settled around me, but I barely noticed, absorbed in the words of a woman who had been dead for 18 years. There were more details I hadn't fully processed in my first reading, references to specific accounts and transactions, names of donors that seemed to appear with suspicious regularity, mentions of meetings between Father Donovan and various businessmen and politicians. One name appeared repeatedly: Victor Hargreaves. Sister Maria had noted his visits to the chapel, his private meetings with Father Donovan, his generous donations that seemed to coincide with zoning changes for his development projects. What I found convinced me that the disappearance of the 4 nuns was no spiritual mystery but something far more human and possibly sinister. This was about money and power, about corruption that had infiltrated sacred spaces, about 4 women who had stood for truth and paid the ultimate price. As I finally drifted towards sleep in the early hours of the morning, the journal safely hidden beneath my mattress, I made a decision. I would not let their voices be silenced again. I would find out what had happened to Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine, no matter where that quest might lead. Outside, the storm finally began to abate, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the roof. But within the walls of St. Benedict's Monastery, another storm was just beginning, one that would uncover long-buried secrets and shake foundations both literal and figurative. And I, Brother Thomas, a monk of only 3 months standing, would be at its center. I couldn't sleep that night. Sister Maria's journal entries had planted questions in my mind that refused to be silent. The words on those pages haunted me, the meticulous documentation of suspicious transactions, the growing realization of corruption, and that final, chilling entry written in haste as unknown visitors arrived in the middle of a storm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw 4 women in habits facing unknown figures in the darkness of the chapel, rain lashing against the windows as thunder shook the walls. By dawn, I had made my decision. Before morning prayers, I slipped out of my cell and into the corridor, my footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. The monastery was quiet at this hour, most of my brothers still in their cells preparing for the day ahead. Father Gregory would be in his office already. He was an early riser, but his path wouldn't cross mine as I made my way to the side entrance. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a mist that clung to the grounds like a shroud. The world was washed clean, glistening in the pale early light. Droplets hung from every branch and blade of grass, transforming the monastery gardens into a sea of tiny mirrors reflecting the gradually brightening sky. My breath formed small clouds in the cool morning air as I followed the path back to St. Catherine's Chapel. This time, I brought a flashlight to properly examine the chapel. I had been too preoccupied with Sister Maria's journal yesterday to give the building itself a thorough inspection. Something about her descriptions didn't match the layout I'd seen. She mentioned a basement storage area, but I hadn't noticed any stairs leading down. The key turned more easily in the lock today, as if the door had remembered me and decided to be more accommodating. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the dusty interior with pools of colored light. Sapphire blues, ruby reds, and amber golds transforming the humble space into something almost ethereal. Without the storm raging outside, the chapel felt less foreboding, though no less burdened by its secrets. I began methodically searching, moving from the nave to the vestry, tapping walls and examining the floor for any sign of a hidden entrance. The main area yielded nothing unusual, just pews arranged in neat rows facing the altar, a small choir loft accessible by a narrow spiral staircase, and the expected liturgical furnishings, all covered in dust and showing signs of neglect. In the vestry, I moved more slowly, paying careful attention to every detail. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with vestment closets along one wall, the filing cabinet I'd searched yesterday, and a heavy oak cabinet that presumably once held communion vessels and other sacred items. A narrow window looked out onto the cemetery behind the chapel, where headstones tilted at various angles, many so weathered their inscriptions were no longer legible. It was behind the heavy oak vestment cabinet that I found it. A door, painted to match the stone wall so perfectly that it was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. I only noticed it because of a slight variation in the mortar lines, a pattern that didn't quite align with the surrounding wall. The cabinet had been positioned to conceal it almost entirely, leaving just enough space that someone who knew what they were looking for could slip through. The cabinet itself was immensely heavy, its oak frame solid and unyielding. I braced my shoulder against it and pushed with all my strength. For a moment, nothing happened. And then it began to move with a low, scraping sound, its feet leaving marks in the dust that had accumulated on the floor. Inch by inch, I revealed the hidden door. It wasn't locked, just stuck from years of disuse. The hinges protested with a high-pitched squeal that made me wince, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent chapel. It took all my strength to pull it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of earth and neglect. I hesitated only briefly before starting down, my flashlight beam bouncing off the damp stone walls. The stairs were steep and uneven, worn in the center from countless footsteps over the years. I counted 23 steps before reaching the bottom, finding myself in a space that felt much older than the chapel above, almost medieval in its construction. The basement was small and cluttered with boxes of church supplies, candles still in their cardboard packaging, hymnals with faded covers, folded altar linens yellowed with age, and seasonal decorations organized by the liturgical calendar. Christmas nativity figures stood frozen in a cardboard box, their painted faces watching me with blank expressions. dusty Easter lilies made of fabric poked out of another container. Everything was coated with the fine dust that accumulates in undisturbed places, like the gentle snowfall of passing time. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained why 4 nuns had vanished without a trace. But Sister Maria had been specific about finding documents here. I began searching systematically, moving boxes and examining the walls and floor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The basement walls were made of rough-hewn stone, clearly predating the chapel above. This foundation might have supported another structure before St. Catherine's was built. I ran my hands along the cool surface, feeling for any irregularities that might indicate a hidden compartment. In the corner, partially hidden by a stack of moldering Christmas decorations, artificial wreaths whose plastic needles had long since lost their color, I found a loose stone in the floor. It didn't look different from the others around it, but when my flashlight beam passed across it, I noticed a slight depression around its edges, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. My heart began to beat faster as I knelt and worked my fingers into the shallow groove. The stone was heavy, but it moved, scraping against its neighbors as I pried it up. Beneath was a small cavity, perhaps 10 inches square and equally deep. Inside sat a metal lockbox, its surface dulled with age but free from the dust that covered everything else in the basement. Someone had accessed this hiding place relatively recently. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy, made of solid steel with a sturdy combination lock securing its contents. There was no way to open it here without the combination or tools. I would have to take it with me. But before I left, something else caught my eye. On the underside of the stone I had removed, barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight, was a small cross etched into the surface. It wasn't elaborate, just 2 simple lines intersecting, but it had clearly been carved with purpose. A marker, perhaps, or a silent testament of faith from whoever had hidden the lockbox. I replaced the stone carefully, trying to position it exactly as I had found it. Then I turned my attention back to the lockbox. It was locked, but the rusty mechanism gave way after some persuasion with a screwdriver I found among the maintenance supplies stored along one wall. The hasp broke with a sharp snap that echoed in the confined space, making me freeze momentarily, listening for any response from above. But the chapel remained silent, its secrets still held close. Inside the lockbox were USB drives, neatly labeled with dates ranging from 2001 to 2007, and a thick manila envelope. The envelope contained bank statements for accounts I'd never heard of, all bearing the header of Saint. Catherine's Charitable Foundation, an entity that, as far as I knew, had never officially existed. I flipped through the statements, my seminary accounting classes coming back to me as I recognized the hallmarks of financial impropriety. The statements showed millions of dollars moving through the accounts, just as Sister Maria had described. Donations would come in from wealthy patrons, then immediately transfer to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. It looked like textbook money laundering, using the chapel's status as a religious institution to clean dirty money. There were also photographs, color prints showing Father Donovan shaking hands with men in expensive suits at fundraising galas and private dinners. These weren't official church functions. They were too lavish, too secular. Crystal champagne flutes glinted in the background. Women in evening gowns mingled with men wearing watches that cost more than what I had earned in a year before joining the monastery. I recognized one of the men as Victor Hargreaves, a real estate developer whose name had been in the Boston newspapers regularly during my years as an accountant there. He'd been investigated for fraud multiple times, but never convicted, always managing to settle out of court or have cases dismissed on technicalities. His silver hair and too-perfect smile were unmistakable. His arm draped casually around Father Donovan's shoulders in a gesture of familiarity that seemed inappropriate between a priest and a businessman. Another photograph showed Father Donovan seated at a dinner table with Senator James Whitmore, who'd been on the Senate Finance Committee until a scandal forced his resignation in 2010. I remembered the news stories. Allegations of corruption that were never quite proven, a hasty retirement citing health concerns, and then a quiet rehabilitation as a consultant for various industries he had once regulated. As I examined these materials, the implications became clear. St. Catherine's Chapel had been used as a front for laundering money, with Father Donovan as the likely facilitator. The 4 nuns had stumbled upon evidence of this operation, and then they had disappeared. The connection seemed undeniable, too direct to be coincidence. The dim basement suddenly felt airless, as if the weight of this revelation was physically pressing down on me. I sat back on my heels, flashlight beam dancing across the damp stone walls, and tried to process what I had discovered. This wasn't just about missing nuns anymore. This was about corruption that potentially reached into the highest levels of both the church and state. I carefully repacked everything into the lockbox and tucked it under my arm. The broken lock would be noticeable, but I had no way to repair it now. Time was running short. Morning prayers would be ending soon, and my absence would be noted if I didn't return to the monastery. As I climbed the stairs, a shaft of sunlight from the vestry window caught me by surprise. How long had I been in the basement? The quality of light suggested mid-morning rather than early dawn. I had lost track of time, absorbed in the past and its dark secrets. I secured the hidden door as best I could and pushed the heavy cabinet back into position. It would be obvious to anyone looking closely that it had been moved. The tracks in the dust couldn't be erased, but I hoped no one would have reason to visit the chapel anytime soon. Outside, the mist had burned away, revealing a clear spring day that seemed cruelly incongruous with the dark discoveries I had made. Birds sang in the trees lining the path back to the monastery, and wildflowers were beginning to push through the damp earth. Life continuing its cycles, oblivious to human corruption and tragedy. I concealed the lockbox beneath my habit as best I could, its hard edges digging into my side as I walked briskly back toward St. Benedict's. My mind was racing, processing what I had found and what it meant. These weren't just financial irregularities, they were evidence of crimes, possibly including murder. What should I do with this information? The direct approach would be to take it to Father Gregory immediately. He was a good man, dedicated to his vocation and to the truth as he understood it. But the corruption I had uncovered had tentacles reaching into the church hierarchy. Could I be certain he wasn't somehow involved? Or that he wouldn't feel obligated to report my findings to superiors who might have connections to the people implicated in these documents? No, I needed outside help first. Someone with expertise in financial crimes. Someone I could trust implicitly. And I knew exactly who that person was. As I approached the monastery, the bells began to ring, calling the brothers to their mid-morning duties. I slipped in through a side entrance, avoiding the main courtyard where I might be seen. In my cell, I carefully hid the lockbox beneath the loose floorboard under my bed, a hiding place I had discovered my first week here, but had never had reason to use until now. Then I knelt beside my bed and prayed for guidance. The path ahead would not be easy or straightforward. I was a monk, pledged to obedience and the ordered life of the monastery. But I was also a seeker of truth, committed to justice. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of 4 dedicated women were waiting for someone to finally uncover what had happened on that stormy night 18 years ago. "Give me strength," I whispered, my fingers moving over the rosary beads that hung at my waist. "Give me wisdom." Rising from my prayers, I felt a sense of purpose settling over me. I would need to move carefully, gathering information and allies before taking any definitive action, but I would not let this discovery be buried again. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, I would find out what had happened to Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine, and I would make sure those responsible answered for their crimes. I needed help. Someone with expertise I didn't have, someone I could trust. Before joining the monastery, I had worked as an accountant at a large firm in Boston. One of my former colleagues, Diana Chen, had specialized in forensic accounting. If anyone could make sense of these financial records, it would be her. I called Diana from the monastery's phone, careful to ensure no one could overhear. "It's Thomas Mercer," I said when she answered. "I need your help with something. Sensitive." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Worcester, halfway between the monastery and Boston. I brought the lockbox, having told Father Gregory I needed a personal day to visit my doctor. Diana hadn't changed much in the 5 years since I'd seen her. Still sharp-eyed and practical, her dark hair now streaked with silver. She listened without interruption as I explained about the chapel, the missing nuns, and the financial documents I'd found. "You understand what you might be getting into, right?" she asked when I finished. "If what you're suggesting is true, if these nuns were eliminated because of what they discovered, then whoever was behind this wouldn't hesitate to do the same to you." "I took vows to seek truth and justice," I said. "I can't just ignore this." Diana spent hours analyzing the documents and USB drives I'd brought. The drives contained spreadsheets detailing every transaction, with notes about the actual sources of the funds, many from organizations with known connections to organized crime. "This is sophisticated," Diana said, frowning at her laptop screen. "They used the chapel as a legitimate front. Donations came in from real people but were immediately mixed with dirty money and moved offshore. The legitimate donations provided cover for the whole operation." "Who could organize something like this?" I asked. "Someone with connections to both the church hierarchy and the criminal world," Diana replied. "The amounts we're talking about, over $50 million over 6 years, now that's not small time. And look at these names." She pointed to a spreadsheet. "These are powerful people, Thomas. Politicians, business leaders, even a federal judge." The gravity of what we were uncovering settled over me like a physical weight. 4 women had likely died because they discovered this network. How far would these people go to keep their secrets? "There's something else," Diana said, turning her laptop toward me. I traced some of these offshore accounts. Most are dead ends, but a few led to investments in real estate developments around Boston, all projects headed by Victor Hargreaves' company. The same projects that displaced low-income communities and were fast-tracked through zoning regulations despite public protests. The corruption was even more extensive than I had imagined. This wasn't just about money. It was about power and influence used to benefit the few at the expense of the many. "What do we do with this information?" I asked. Diana closed her laptop. "Very carefully, Thomas. Very carefully." Diana connected me with retired Detective Michael Reeves, who had led the original investigation into the nuns' disappearance. We met at his modest home in a Boston suburb the following week. Reeves was a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. His living room walls were covered with family photos, but there was also a small bulletin board with newspaper clippings about the missing nuns. "Never could let this one go," he said, noticing my gaze. 4 women of God just vanish into thin air. No bodies, no evidence, nothing but some tire tracks in the mud that the rain washed away before we could get proper casts. He shook his head. "It haunted me all the way to retirement. I showed him what Diana and I had discovered. As he went through the materials, his expression darkened. "I always suspected something wasn't right," he said. "We were pushed to wrap up the investigation too quickly. My captain kept saying they probably just left, decided to abandon their vocation. But their personal belongings were still there. Clothes, photos, everything." "Did you look into Father Donovan?" I asked. Reeves nodded grimly. "As much as I could. He had an alibi for that night, claimed he was at a church conference in New York. Had witnesses too, other priests who vouched for him. But here's the thing. There was a gap of about 6 hours where no one could account for his whereabouts. Enough time to drive to the chapel and back if he pushed the speed limit. You think he was involved in their disappearance? I think he knew more than he ever told us." Reeves tapped the financial documents. "This gives us motive. The sisters find out about his money laundering operation, threaten to expose him, and then they disappear. Classic." "But he couldn't have done it alone," I said. "No, he'd need help." Reeves pulled out a map of the area around St. Catherine's Chapel. "The chapel is isolated. Nearest neighbor is over a mile away. 4 women, even if they were surprised, subduing them would take multiple people." He pointed to a large property not far from the chapel. "This land here belonged to Victor Hargreaves. Had a hunting cabin on it. Police never searched it during the original investigation because we had no probable cause, and Hargreaves was politically connected. Too connected, now that I think about it. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore." "What happened to that property?" I asked. "Hargreaves donated it to a conservation trust in 2010. No one's allowed to build on it now. It's protected wilderness. Or a convenient way to ensure no one ever disturbs whatever might be buried there," I said softly. Reeves looked at me with new respect. "You know, for a monk, you think like a detective. Before I joined the monastery, I worked as an accountant. I followed paper trails, looked for discrepancies. Not so different from what you do. Well, Brother Thomas, I think it's time we did what should have been done 18 years ago. Take a closer look at Victor Hargreaves' old property." The following Saturday, Reeves and I hiked through the conservation land that had once belonged to Victor Hargreaves. I had told Father Gregory I was participating in an interfaith community service project. Not entirely a lie, as seeking justice for the missing sisters was a form of service. The early summer heat made the trek challenging, especially in my traditional habit, but I had insisted on wearing it. In rural Massachusetts, a monk wandering through the woods might raise eyebrows, but would generally be left alone out of respect. After nearly 2 hours of following overgrown trails, we found what remained of the hunting cabin, little more than a stone foundation and chimney, the wooden structure having long since collapsed from neglect. Property records showed it was a substantial structure, Reeves said, surveying the ruins. 3 bedrooms, kitchen, living area, more of a vacation home than a hunting cabin, really. We began methodically searching the area, looking for anything unusual. It was slow, painstaking work, made more difficult by 18 years of natural reclamation. Trees had grown through what had once been the cabin's floor, and underbrush covered most of the foundation. It was as we cleared away vines from what appeared to be a root cellar door that Reeves froze. "Look at this lock," he said quietly. "It's newer than everything else here." The padlock securing the cellar door was indeed modern, still shiny despite exposure to the elements, with minimal rust. Someone had been here relatively recently. Reeves produced a small set of lockpicking tools from his pocket. "Old habits," he explained with a shrug as he worked on the lock. After several minutes of careful manipulation, it opened with a soft click. The cellar door was heavy, requiring both of us to lift it. Below was a set of concrete stairs descending into darkness. Reeves switched on his flashlight and I followed him down. The cellar was larger than I expected, with a poured concrete floor and walls. It had been cleaned out almost entirely, but in their haste, whoever had done so had missed a few items. A rusty set of chains bolted to one wall, a single woman's shoe covered in dust, and most significantly, a weatherproof document case tucked into a crevice where the wall met the floor. Inside the case were more financial records, handwritten ledgers that matched the electronic records we'd found on the USB drives. But there was also a small address book with names and phone numbers, many of which had been featured in the financial documents. "This is evidence," Reeves said, his voice tight with emotion. "Evidence that someone tried very hard to eliminate." "Do you think the sisters were held here?" I asked, looking at the chains with growing horror. "Maybe temporarily," Reeves replied, "but not long-term. This place is too close to hiking trails, too easily discovered." He surveyed the cellar grimly. "No, this was a processing site, somewhere they could be brought to be questioned about what they knew, who they'd told." I didn't ask what processing meant. I didn't need to. "We need to document everything before we touch anything else," Reeves said, pulling out his phone to take photographs. "Then, we need to call in some favors with people I still trust at the Bureau." As we carefully recorded the scene, I noticed something scratched into the concrete near the chains. 4 small crosses side by side. A final act of faith from women who knew they wouldn't leave this place alive. I said a silent prayer for Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine. With evidence mounting, we needed to proceed cautiously. The network of people implicated in the financial documents was extensive and influential. Reeves suggested we needed public pressure, a spotlight that would make it harder for anyone to sweep this under the rug again. He introduced me to Olivia Martinez, an investigative journalist with the Boston Globe who had built her reputation exposing corruption. We met in the newspaper's conference room, where security cameras would record anyone entering or leaving, a precaution that underscored the seriousness of our situation. Olivia was in her 30s, with keen eyes that missed nothing, and a notebook already open before we'd even sat down. "Detective Reeves says you found evidence related to the St. Catherine's disappearances," she said. "I remember that case. I was just starting out at the Globe when it happened." I placed Sister Maria's journal and copies of the financial documents on the table. "It was never about the nuns leaving their vocation," I said. "It was about what they found." For the next 2 hours, we laid out everything we had discovered. The money laundering operation using the chapel as a front, the connections to powerful people including Victor Hargreaves and Senator Whitmore, and the evidence from the hunting cabin cellar. Olivia took meticulous notes, occasionally stopping us to ask for clarification. "This is explosive," she said finally. "You're talking about a conspiracy involving religious officials, politicians, and possibly organized crime. People have been killed for exposing far less." "That's why we came to you," Reeves said. "This needs to be too public to bury." "I'll need to verify everything independently," Olivia said. "And my editor will insist on at least 2 corroborating sources for each major claim. This isn't something we can rush." "The sisters have waited 18 years for justice," I said. "We can be thorough." Over the next 3 weeks, I continued my duties at the monastery, while secretly meeting with Olivia when I could. She had begun the painstaking work of verification, cross-referencing financial records with public documents, and conducting background interviews without revealing the full scope of her investigation. "The pieces fit," she told me during one of our meetings. I've confirmed that several of the donors to St. Catherine's Charitable Foundation were shell companies linked to known associates of organized crime families. And 3 of Senator Whitmore's legislative initiatives directly benefited Hargreaves' development projects. "What about Father Donovan?" I asked. "His banking records show regular deposits of exactly $9,999, just under the amount that would trigger automatic reporting to financial authorities. Classic structuring to avoid detection." She closed her notebook. "I'm almost ready to start writing, but there's one more person we need to talk to, Bishop Reynolds." "What is the current head of the diocese? Why?" "Because he was auxiliary bishop when all this happened. If there was a cover-up within the church, he might have knowledge of it, whether he was complicit or not." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Bishop Reynolds occasionally visited our monastery. Approaching him would mean potentially exposing my involvement before we were ready. "Is that wise?" I asked. "Necessary," Olivia replied. "For the story to have maximum impact, we need to give everyone involved a chance to respond. And sometimes, when confronted directly, people talk." Arranging a meeting with Bishop Reynolds proved surprisingly easy. He was scheduled to visit St. Benedict's for our annual retreat, and I requested a private consultation regarding a matter of historical significance for the diocese. We met in the monastery's library, a quiet space lined with theological texts accumulated over generations. Bishop Reynolds was in his 70s now, his once imposing frame slightly stooped with age, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing. "Brother Thomas," he greeted me, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a lifelong pastor. "Father Gregory speaks highly of your dedication. How can I help you today?" I had rehearsed this conversation countless times, yet now that the moment had arrived, I found myself hesitating. This man had baptized countless children, comforted the dying, led the faithful, and might also have helped cover up the murder of 4 women devoted to the church. "I've been researching the history of St. Catherine's Chapel," I began carefully, "particularly the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the 4 sisters in 2007. The bishop's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his hands tighten slightly on the armrests of his chair. "A tragic mystery," he said. "One that caused great pain to our diocese." "I believe it's no longer a mystery, Your Excellency." I placed Sister Maria's journal on the table between us. "I found this hidden in the chapel, and other evidence as well." Bishop Reynolds stared at the journal, but made no move to touch it. "What exactly are you suggesting, Brother Thomas?" "I'm suggesting that Sisters Maria, Catherine, Agnes, and Josephine discovered a money laundering operation being run through St. Catherine's Chapel, that they confronted Father Donovan about it and subsequently disappeared, and that their disappearance was not investigated as thoroughly as it should have been." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, the bishop sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "You have no idea the pressures that exist at certain levels of the church," he said quietly, "the compromises that sometimes must be made." My heart sank. It was as close to an admission as I was likely to get. "What happened to them?" I asked. "I don't know the details," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and that is the truth before God." Father Donovan came to me afterward, distraught. He said there had been an accident involving the sisters, that men working for Hargreaves had gone too far when the sisters threatened to expose the financial arrangements. "And you didn't report this to the police?" By then, the investigation was already underway. Donovan assured me the situation had been handled, that nothing would be found. The bishop's eyes met mine. "The diocese was in financial trouble, Thomas. The arrangement with Hargreaves and his associates brought in millions that funded schools, hospitals, outreach programs. I told myself it was for the greater good. 4 women died, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. Yes. The word seemed dragged from him. A sin for which I have done penance every day since, though I know it can never be enough. There's a journalist preparing to publish this story, I told him. Everything, the money laundering, the connections to Hargreaves and Senator Whitmore, the evidence we found at the hunting cabin. For a moment, I thought the bishop might collapse. Then, straightening his shoulders with visible effort, he nodded once. Perhaps it's time. The truth will out, as they say. Will you go on record? Tell what you know. To do so would destroy what remains of my life and reputation. Those 4 women had their entire lives taken from them, I reminded him. Bishop Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. Yes, I will speak with your journalist. The Boston Globe's front-page headline read, "Unholy Alliance, Church Money, Laundering Scheme Linked to Missing Nuns Case." Olivia's meticulously researched article laid out the entire conspiracy, including Bishop Reynolds' admission of his knowledge after the fact. Accompanying the article were photographs of the evidence from the hunting cabin cellar and financial documents showing the money trail. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. The FBI reopened the investigation into the disappearance of the 4 nuns. Bishop Reynolds resigned his position, citing health concerns but promising full cooperation with authorities. Several former associates of Victor Hargreaves were arrested on financial charges, with more serious charges expected as the investigation progressed. Hargreaves himself, now in his 80s and in poor health, was placed under house arrest while prosecutors built their case. Senator Whitmore, long since retired but still influential in political circles, suffered a stroke the day after the story broke and was hospitalized in critical condition. The diocese issued a formal apology to the families of Sisters Maria Contreras, Catherine O'Leary, Agnes Kim, and Josephine Mbeki. A memorial service was held at St. Catherine's Chapel, which was reopened and rededicated as a place of remembrance and reconciliation. I attended the service, watching from the back as hundreds of people filled the small chapel, spilling out onto the grounds. Family members of the missing sisters placed photographs on the altar, smiling women in both religious habits and civilian clothes, their lives cut short for having the courage to stand for truth. Father Gregory found me after the service. "You could have come to me," he said, not unkindly. "I would have helped." "I needed to be certain first," I replied, and I wasn't sure how far the corruption reached. He nodded in understanding. "The abbot has been fielding calls all week, from the media, from the Vatican, from law enforcement. They all want to speak with you." "I've said all I need to say," I told him, "through Miss Martinez's reporting. Nevertheless, there will be inquiries, investigations, legal proceedings in which you may be called to testify." Father Gregory placed a hand on my shoulder. "The monastery will support you, Brother Thomas. You've done a difficult but necessary thing." In the days that followed, I struggled with my emotions. There was relief that the truth had finally been revealed, sorrow for the 4 women whose bodies had still not been found, and a lingering anger at the systems and individuals that had allowed such corruption to flourish within sacred walls. I spent many hours in prayer, seeking peace. It came gradually, like the slow clearing of mist after a storm. Not complete, not perfect, but enough to continue my journey. And then, exactly 1 month after the story broke, I received an unexpected visitor at the monastery. She came during evening prayers, waiting patiently in the visitors' area until the service concluded. An elderly woman with silver hair and dark skin, dressed simply but elegantly. When I entered the room, her eyes found mine immediately, as if she had been searching for me specifically. "Brother Thomas," she said, rising from her seat, "my name is Josephine Mbeki." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sister Josephine, one of the 4 missing nuns. "That's not possible," I whispered. She smiled sadly. And yet, here I am. We sat in the monastery garden, the summer evening warm around us as she told her story. "I wasn't there that night," she explained. "I had gone to visit my dying mother in Detroit 2 days earlier. When I returned, they were gone and the police were everywhere." "But you never came forward," I said, still struggling to process her existence. "I tried at first. I went to the police, told them about the financial documents we had found. The detective, not your friend Reeves, a different one, took my statement but seemed uninterested. The next day, a man approached me outside my mother's home. He showed me pictures of my family, my nieces and nephews, my siblings. He said if I continued talking about St. Catherine's or the financial records, they would suffer unfortunate accidents." She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I was a coward. I fled. Changed my name, moved to Canada. I've lived there quietly ever since, always looking over my shoulder." "You weren't a coward," I said. "You were threatened. You survived. At what cost?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Maria, Catherine, Agnes, they were my sisters in every way that mattered. I abandoned their memory." "You're here now," I reminded her. "You can tell your story, help bring them justice." Sister Josephine, or simply Josephine now, as she had left religious life behind in her new identity, nodded slowly. "Yes, that's why I've come. I read the article. I saw what you found. I have information that might help locate—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Their remains," I completed gently. "Yes. There was a place Hargreaves mentioned once when he thought none of us were listening. A limestone quarry on his property, abandoned decades ago. He joked that it was deep enough to keep secrets forever. The next day, I accompanied Josephine to the FBI field office in Boston, where she gave a full statement. 3 days later, a search team found human remains in the abandoned quarry, exactly where she had indicated. DNA testing would eventually confirm they belonged to Sisters Maria, Catherine, and Agnes. They were given a proper burial in the cemetery behind St. Catherine's Chapel, with Josephine in attendance, finally able to say goodbye to her friends. Victor Hargreaves died before he could stand trial, but 3 of his associates were convicted of conspiracy, financial crimes, and murder. The money laundering network was dismantled, its participants exposed. Senator Whitmore recovered from his stroke only to face federal charges. He eventually entered a plea agreement that implicated others in exchange for a reduced sentence. As for me, I remained at St. Benedict's, continuing my vocation. St. Catherine's Chapel became my special responsibility. I renovated it with help from volunteers, restoring its beauty while preserving its role as a memorial. Josephine visited often, helping to establish a scholarship fund in memory of the 3 sisters. They dedicated their lives to truth and service, she told me during one such visit. This way, their work continues. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the chapel at dusk, I think about the 4 women whose courage revealed corruption that had festered for years within walls meant to be sacred. 3 paid with their lives. 1 carried the burden of survival and secrecy for 18 long years. Their story reminds me that faith is not just about ritual and prayer, but about moral courage and the pursuit of justice, even when that pursuit leads to uncomfortable truths about the institutions we hold dear. The rain still drums on the chapel roof during storms, but it no longer feels foreboding. Instead, it sounds like applause from heaven for 4 brave women who refused to be silent in the face of wrong and for the truth that, however delayed, finally came to light. The end.